Content for Devs episode. This is episode 1, and today we are guesting Tim Noetzel. Tim, did I pronounce your last name correctly? Or
Yep, that's exactly right. It's Netzel.
awesome. So, Tim, would you like to introduce yourself before we start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a freelance web developer and UX designer. I've been a dev and designer for about 15 years professionally, though honestly, it feels like kind of my whole life at this point. I work mainly with e-commerce companies and tech startups. And I'm also the founder of freelancegps.com, where I teach other developers and designers how to start and grow successful freelance businesses.
Awesome. And what it takes to drive such like maybe I put it this way. Is the like freelance GPS your only job right now, or are you still like a freelancer, developer, and you are maintaining like multiple jobs at the moment?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, my full time gig is freelancing for e-commerce companies and tech startups. Freelance GPS is really just like a passion project of mine because freelancing has been so transformational in my life. It's given me, better income, so much freedom, and I really just want to help other developers and folks in the tech industry get that too.
Awesome. Like, does it consume a lot of time during the week?
Yeah, yeah, it definitely does. I'm constantly creating content, collaborating with other folks like you. I coach a few freelancers one on one. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of work that goes into it.
And how do you maintain this? Like, do you have like a dedicated days to this passion project, or do you like have it, whenever the time goes?
Yeah, so I used to do it that way. I used to focus on it like solely on Fridays. But I've actually kind of changed that recently. So I'm spending kind of more time throughout the week. So usually what I'll do is start my morning by spending a little bit of time on it. And so 1 to 2 hours a day kind of thing. And I found that that works a lot better. It's just, you're putting in a little bit every day and you can kind of see the momentum build throughout the week, which is nice.
Oh, that's interesting, because this is the completely the opposite thing of my experience. I mean, my effort recently is to dedicate one day fully into the content creation, because I'm driving content for devs and Hanami Mastery projects, and I do struggle with finding this this everyday effort and the time frame for to push things forward every day, but just by a little bit. So your perspective is quite counterintuitive to me, and yeah, I will try to dig into this more, because maybe there is something fundamental that I'm doing wrong. But I will address this during this talk, because today we are going to talk about the burnout, and about struggling really with the day-to-day job, with the motivation, determination, long-term efforts. And why do you think you are eligible or credible to talk about these topics?
Yeah, so I've worked in the tech industry for 15 years. Mainly at tech startups, which are kind of highly volatile, like high energy places. A lot of people get burnt out there. I certainly have before. And I've also been freelancing full time for about 5 years, which is another place that people kind of historically experience burnout. So I think the first thing is I've experienced it in kind of both cases, working for other people and working for myself. And I've also kind of come out the other side of it. And so I think part of it is really just the experience of developing kind of some tactics to prevent burnout in the first place and to handle it when it does crop up.
So, how do you understand the burnout?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways to think about burnout. Um, I think fundamentally burnout comes from a few different places. One of them is just kind of trying to do too much all the time, more generally, and I think that's the way most people sort of understand it. But I also think it's about two other things that are just as important, if not more so. One of them is not feeling like you can ever switch off. And so feeling like you are always sort of on call, particularly if you're a freelancer, where you're getting messages from clients at all hours of the day and night, and so you're kind of feeling like you always have to respond to stuff. You never really get a break. That I think is a big source of burnout. And I think the other one comes down to spending too much time doing things that aren't necessarily aligned with your core passions or your core talents. So if you are naturally introverted, for example, spending too much of your time doing things that are really extroverted, I think can be a source of burnout. Spending too much of your time um, working on the types of projects that really are like don't come naturally to you, that kind of a thing, right? And so in my mind, avoiding burnout, it really comes down to keeping things in balance more than anything else, right? So that tends to be how I think about it at a very kind of high level.
So I will dig a little bit further here. So there is this burnout, but there is also like a complete depression, like a disease, really, this psychological disease. And there are also temporary struggles. Like every one of us can have worse week, or we can be like overwhelmed during a single day or even a month, right? Is there like a clear strategy how to distinguish, how to recognize what is healthy and what not, and where to start worrying about?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think the thing that's to me very interesting in what you just said is that often burnout can be one of the sort of causes of depression, right? But they're not necessarily the same thing, right? And I think there's all sorts of psychological markers for depression, and I'm certainly not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I can't speak to those definitively, but they're things like a feeling of hopelessness, like not wanting to get out of bed in the morning, those types of things, right? I think in my mind, burnout shares a lot of those same traits, but kind of turned down a notch, right? And so I think oftentimes people experience it as like um, feeling like they don't really want to do day after day after day the things that they're supposed to be doing, right? And kind of showing up and going through the motions, but not necessarily being really energized. And sort of experiencing like a lot of fatigue when they're working, but not necessarily fatigue the rest of the time, if that makes sense. And so I think that is kind of one of the hallmarks when you start to notice like you really are not looking forward to your work, but you are kind of excited about like stuff in your personal life or whatever else, right? That may be an indication that you're starting to burn out, right? And obviously one of the ways to sort of handle burnout is to try to turn things down a little bit, right? Take a break, take a vacation, that kind of thing. But oftentimes that's not enough. And I think particularly when people feel like there's no sort of escape from their burnout, and especially for people for whom their work is a really important part of their lives and their identity, that's when you can start kind of transition over into depression, where it's kind of like, it feels just like very, very soul crushing and demotivating because, your work, which is so important to you, is not in line with what you need at that particular time, and you don't feel like there's anything you can do to fix it.
Cool. And do you like is it like when it happens, when people feel most often that they have no escape, like they cannot make a break? I do feel like this is kind of like an entrepreneurship disease. Like when you are self-employed, you have like clients. Like there are people that I know that have not been on holidays for years, and but do you experience it from a different perspective as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely think entrepreneurs are particularly prone to this, um, because they are taking on things that are so challenging, right? Like when you're starting or running a business, you're forced to wear a lot of different hats, right? You take on a lot of different roles, and the reality is that not all of those roles are going to come naturally to you. It's very rare to find someone who has natural talent in every single area that they have to take on, right? And combined with the pace that you have to go at, right? Particularly when you're not when you're just getting started, but once you've started to have some success, right? You're constantly dealing with clients or customers. You're struggling with all of the different things around building a business, making sure that you're making enough money, making sure you're serving your clients well, all of those kinds of things. I think that burnout is extremely common for entrepreneurs, but it can hit anybody. You can have a developer working a 9 to 5 job, who, whether it's because they're just starting to get bored of the project, they're starting to do, the same thing over and over and over again, and they're not really being challenged, right? Or maybe they have a bad manager who's kind of like constantly undermining them, or making them feel like they're not valued. Like any of those kinds of things, I think can lead to burnout. And so it's certainly not something that's experienced only by entrepreneurs.
Cool. I do. Yeah, I maybe I'm not the best person here because I'm kind of am. I am kind of like an entrepreneur, but more like self-employed. But I do experience. Maybe I did experience a burnout or something similar even this week, really. Like when I took just too much and I had been overwhelmed in my daily job for months. And when you add on top of it your like kids, family, sleepless nights, and things like that, like when all that adds up, at one point I could not do anything really. And I needed to prioritize stuff. So I prioritized the daily job, which was the most profitable part of whatever I'm doing. But when I put aside my side projects, I actually, yeah, felt better, but not after a week, but after like a month. And that that was one of the things that helped me. But after coming back from holidays, for example, for this Content for Devs podcast, together with Fede, because we experienced some health issues, we decided to split the efforts into seasons. So we lowered the efforts, to not push ourselves every week to interview another person. And that was like the key thing that freed up my mind. And those are the things that helped me. But do you have other ways, other things that how people can avoid burning out in their daily jobs? And because this is for developers, maybe we can focus on the developers or freelancers mostly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think you kind of hit on on one of the main ones, that's a little bit more on the reactive side, which is once you notice that you're starting to burn out, like take a step back, right? And hit pause on a few things. And that's certainly something that I've done in the past. Even this year, there was, a time when I was kind of feeling like I was burning out. And so I simply took a little bit of a break from doing most of the stuff that I was doing for freelance GPS. Right. And the idea was like, I'm not going to stop this permanently or anything like that. I'm just going to take a little bit of a step back and turn the dial down. And I think, on a more proactive side, making sure that you're getting time for yourself regularly and getting time to do things that aren't deliberately productive, but just kind of recharging for you before you start to feel burnt out can be really, really helpful. Right. And so that might be, playing a video game every day for 30 minutes, right? Or going for a walk or whatever else, right? Something that you find recharging and enjoyable that doesn't feel like work, that doesn't really have any, intrinsic monetary value or isn't going to like produce anything other than it's going to make you happy. Right. And I think making sure you're getting enough of that time on an ongoing basis doing that is a great tool to kind of prevent burnout in general. I think, another thing that is particularly relevant for both freelancers and developers is really just like setting good boundaries, either with your clients or with your employer, right? And so, for a lot of folks, I think that means like turning off Slack, turning off your work email during, evening hours and on weekends, and being like pretty serious about not checking it. And I think like it's one of those things where I felt for a long time when I was younger, like, oh, this is fine. Like, I don't mind responding to things. It just takes a little bit of time or whatever else. But I would find, that when you'd get a message at 7:30 p.m., on a weeknight, or you get a message over the weekend, I'd start to spend all of my time thinking about that or worrying about how I was going to handle something the next day or when Monday came around. And that type of thing leads to you feeling like you always need to be on. um, you know and when you feel that way, that is, like you're already well on the road to burnout. So I think setting some of those kind of limitations for yourself is really important. I've also found that the way you handle responses when people message you during those times is really important. So if you get, one late night question, right, from a client, you respond to it at night immediately. What that ends up doing is training your clients or your employer to expect responses late at night. And then you get more and more and more of them. So one of the things that I found really helpful is to use, Slack's functionality or your email tools functionality, like Gmail has it. Most of the other email clients have it now, to schedule your responses, right? And so if I get a question late at night and I do happen to see it for whatever reason, I may respond to it right away, but I will set it to not send until the next day.
Mhm.
That way I'm not encouraging another response and another one after that and another one after that. And so that can be really, really helpful. Um, I think another, sort of tactic that's helpful is also to think about delaying some of your responses. So particularly if you're a freelancer and you've got, 5 or 6 projects going on at any given time, right? You may finish something, and typically what you do is, send it to the client for feedback immediately, right? But what I found is if I finish something and I actually have some time, um, scheduling that to send sort of at the due date rather than ahead of the due date gives me a little bit more time to catch my breath, right? And so handling kind of some of that communication in a sort of scheduled fashion is really, really helpful. So that's one technique. I also think there's um, some other things you can do around limiting distractions, and setting boundaries that are really really helpful. That are probably worth talking through as well.
Okay, like when you say about setting boundaries, did you consider things like if you have 5 clients, for example, did you consider to have like separate phones for multiple clients? And then, like for different clients, like separate physical phone, cell phone, so you can have like a mobile Slack applications like scheduled or disabled on different ways, and then the phone shut off on different times, so you can better maintain this focus or context switching, or do you think like this is complete overhead?
Yeah, so I tend to think that's a little bit of overkill. What I do is for Slack, uh, I'm not signed in to any of my clients' Slack channels on my phone. And if I need to, for whatever reason, like I'm on the move, and I need to like respond, then I just sign in. I take care of business and I sign back out. And I do have like a separate email for business that I use, different than my personal email. That way, like if I need to check my personal email, I'm not getting distracted by work email stuff. So that I have found to be really helpful. But I actually think, when you're starting to think about that kind of stuff, you're still kind of playing defense a little bit. And I find that like trying to set boundaries ahead of time, specifically when you first start your relationship with your client, is substantially more helpful, right? And so I try to include boundaries with my clients directly in the statement of work or the contract I sign with them, right? And so what that looks like is making sure that I include limitations on my time in the contract, right? And so that's like maximum number of calls per week, deadlines for the client to deliver feedback or assets or other things that I need to do my work, right? An explanation of like, here's the revision process and here's how many revisions you'll get, and an explanation of like how you'd handle unplanned overages, right? Like if they want to change something about the project, those types of things can be really, really helpful, um, for two reasons, right? Number one, I think it sort of just naturally discourage clients from, kind of pushing boundaries. But also because they get you and your client on the same page before a project starts, right? And so if your client is thinking, hey, like we need to be able to call this guy, multiple times per week to check in on this, and you're thinking like, hey, like there's only going to be like a call every other week, right? That's a pretty big mismatch, right? And you want to know that ahead of time. That way you can make the decision like, oh yeah, like I can accommodate this, but I'm going to charge you more, or I can't really accommodate this, and so maybe I don't want to do this project, or maybe we can meet in the middle, right? That kind of stuff I think is really really helpful. And when you do it ahead of time, what that means is that you get your client on the same page with you, and they're way more likely to be happy. And that has a ton of impacts, just in terms of whether you're likely to be burnt out because they probably won't be sort of pestering you as much, but also an impact on your overall bottom line, right? That I found that the projects go faster and more smoothly. Your client's happier, and that means they're more likely to refer more business your way or write you a recommendation or any of that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of kind of positive impacts for setting those boundaries up front.
You have touched a very important topic, I guess, because most of people, when they just receive the contract proposition, they sign it off. Um, And at least this is my prediction, because I do not work with a lot of freelancers that consult to me how to do the work better, right? But it was definitely my case in the past, and only when I gained some experience with working with different clients, I noticed that they have just templates or proposals, and this is the first step. And do you have the way to negotiate the terms or add some conditions, some changes in the contract? And do you suggest to go with your kind of contract proposition ahead? Do you have a contract template for your clients that you can share with your students, because you also have the freelancing course? Or do you usually just accept the contact from the clients and then just negotiate the changes?
Yeah, so I typically will go with my statement of work and say like, "Hey, I'll put one together." Usually, people are fine with that, and they'll take a look, and if they want changes, they'll bring it up. But I think honestly, the more important point here is less about like like writes the contract down and gives it to the other person to review, and more about like the attitude you have around how projects are created, right? And I think you're right. The vast majority of freelancers, if they get a contract, they just sign it. And I think that is a mistake, but it's honestly it's a bigger indicator that something is wrong even earlier in the process, which is around the sales process, right? I think too often freelancers do one of two things. Either um, they are just sort of accepting the entirety of the project scope direct from the client, or they're pitching the entirety of the project scope to the client. And I think in your sales process, what you really want to be doing is co-designing the project with the client, right? So they're not telling you what to do, you're not telling them what to do, right? Instead, you're kind of collaborating on what the project is going to be. And that really comes from asking good questions in the sales process and making sure that you understand not just what the project is, right? Like, okay, we want to build a new website, but why, right? Why is it important to the business? Why do they want to do this thing now? Are they trying to increase conversion rates? Are they trying to decrease costs? Are they trying to, you know, get their next round of funding, and so they need to hit certain metrics around like user retention? Like, what's the business goal, right? And then together with the client saying, okay, like you had these ideas, some of these I think are going to have a bigger impact than others. Also, have you considered this other idea that I have, right? And starting to put together a scope collaboratively rather than just taking their list and saying, yep, I'll do that, right? And when you do that, you start to shift the client's perspective um, from thinking about you, sort of just as a code monkey to thinking about you as a partner, right? And that in and of itself, I think, is huge because it means the rest of the conversation about how the project is going to go is also a conversation, right? It's not just like, hey, we want these things done at this time and in this way, right? And usually like that leads to a conversation about things like timeline, things like how often you're going to do check-ins, all of that kind of stuff. And you want to make sure you're having that conversation, right? Don't just sign a contract. And if for whatever reason, right, like they're the ones who proposed the contract, make sure you bring those things up if they're not in there, right? And if you're the one who creates the statement of work, make sure that you put those things in there. And it's okay if they come back to you and say, hey, we were thinking we'd want more, right? Like that's totally fine. You really just want to have a conversation with them about it so that you can get on the same page and you can adjust your expectations, potentially adjust your price accordingly.
Hmm. Cool. Thank you for this. So I don't have more questions really about this setting boundaries at the moment, but you also touched the different point so far about having breaks and like you touched like playing games as a break, like an example. But I have found that some developers, especially those that are active in like open source, for example, and I bet that it could also touch freelancers. They can have a passion in programming, and then can not feel that that this is a work, because they like doing it. And if they handle multiple clients, multiple different projects, they there is a trap when you might feel that, okay, I'm taking a break from this project and I'm doing a different project instead. This is a completely different thing. So, obviously I will recover. And even if you take a break for the like playing games, you still are in the front of computer, and there is like very blue, like this boundary of what is healthy and where the work starts, and when they finish, it starts to blur away. It certainly is for me when I'm recording episodes and videos about programming. I'm doing open source about programming, and I'm working for a client which is programming, all in the technology I love, and I'm meeting people that I love. And especially when I'm interviewing you, for example, I don't feel like this is a work. And I have two different initiatives, three different initiatives, completely different. So yeah, where is this trap when passion is your job, and when you should look for different activities to not get
Yeah.
crazy?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really smart question, and a really good sort of implicit point that you're making there, right? Because I think at the end of the day, that's probably something that the vast majority of programmers feel, if I had to guess. That like when we're coding, we're doing something that we're passionate about, and certainly I think developers are kind of almost infamous for getting in those flow states, right? Where you're just, you're coding and like the hours go by and you don't even notice. And that I think is one of the things that's so much fun about being a developer. Um, but I do think that there is, a downside, and there's probably two, right? I mean, one of them I think is probably the one that folks are likely to hear about, like in mass media and that kind of thing, which is just, the idea that, humans as a species were not sort of designed to spend, 12 plus hours a day in front of a screen, right? And so some of it is just, I think, making sure that you take some time to actually get out into the real world and do things that are a little more active or away from a screen. But I also think there's a piece of it with your passion projects where even though they don't necessarily feel like work in the moment, they still are work, right? They require a certain type of thinking and action, right, and focus, and that is all mentally draining, right? And it may not feel like it at the time in any given moment, right? But it can be, I think, pretty draining in aggregate, right? Where if you're constantly trying to focus, right, and you're constantly trying to do, some kind of work or create some kind of output that requires you to sort of be switched on, right? That I think is exhausting in the aggregate and starts to lead to burnout. And I think, if you look at, you know, meditation or yoga or any of those kinds of practices, right? A large part of the idea behind them is really just letting your mind sort of wander, right? And letting your mind sort of be unoccupied with sort of deliberate thinking, and instead, just sort of letting it do its thing, and then bringing it back to sort of focusing on the body or on your breath or on something else, right? And what I've found, and I try to meditate every day, what I've found is that that time actually is really, really refreshing, um, because you're not sort of deliberately thinking things through, right? You're not actively trying to create and trying to focus. And when you do find your mind sort of wandering in those directions, which I think it naturally does, particularly for developers. What you do is you kind of just pull your brain back in and focus on sort of the here and the now. And that act, I think, of letting your mind sort of just be at peace and kind of do its thing naturally, right? Rather than kind of trying to apply it as a tool, which I think is what we as developers are doing sort of day in and day out, is really restorative. And so I think thinking kind of that through and making sure you're sort of paying attention to how much time am I spending doing things that are sort of active and mentally active and mentally taxing, um, is important, even if you're passionate about some of those projects.
Thanks. And there's one more point about personality that you touched in your previous sentences a few minutes ago. If you do too much of what you are not, mm, that is not your skill or advantage. I don't have the word for it, but if you are not born to do certain things, you may find it more difficult, and that also can lead to burning out. And the example for me is that for years I was sure that I'm introverted. um, I'm a developer. I'm enjoying being in front of computer and in the quiet room when no one is here. And I found that a lot of people make me annoying. So I thought that I'm introverted, and I took different personality tests to actually prove me that. And to my surprise, it appeared that I'm completely opposite, and I'm actually an extroverted person, which made me which led to different decisions that I have made in order to start this podcast, for example. Mm, and now I just know that without those tests, I would not start this initiative. But this initiative is very, very important to me to actually meet different people and have this this different thing that I need, that my personality needs, my brain needs, that I was not aware of. And do you find this common? Like most of the developers identify themselves as introverts. And do you have any suggestions in this field? Like, do you find those personality tests useful, or do you have any like recommendations for people to follow?
Yeah, so I think those personality tests can be useful. There's limits to them, right? Some of them are more scientifically informed than others. But honestly, I think that the more important thing is really just trying to be in touch with yourself. And understanding what introversion and extroversion really are, right? Because at the end of the day, right? Extroversion is really being recharged by being around other people, right? And introversion is kind of the opposite of that, right? Finding being around other people somewhat draining and needing to go after you've been around other people, needing to go and have some time by yourself in order to recharge, right? And so there are oftentimes shy extroverts, right? And sort of outgoing introverts, if you will, right? So you can find being around other people draining, but still be, sort of outgoing and good at meeting new people and interacting and all those kinds of things. And so I think understanding the difference, right? Where do you get recharged, right? Making sure you spend enough time in sort of that recharging setting is important. But I also think this applies to sort of skills and personality more broadly, right? Some people are extremely creative, right? And find creativity to be a pretty driving passion. And so if they're not spending regular time sort of creating new things that they come up with, right? Not just building something that somebody else has come up with, right? They're not going to be fulfilled, right? Other people maybe aren't as creative and might sort of prefer, to be very meticulous or, to be really detail oriented or whatever else, right? And these are just two examples. I'm not trying to say these are mutually exclusive or anything like that, right? So, but being, I think, in touch with the things that cause you to feel fulfilled and making sure that you are spending enough time doing those things is really important, right? And I think, like, an example for me would be, um, if I was to try to take a job as an accountant, right, or an air traffic controller, there would be problems, because, like, I would just find that type of work to be extremely boring. And if I was an air traffic controller, my mind would start wandering and planes would be colliding left and right, right? Like it'd be an issue, right? But I also know people who prefer that type of work, right? Where they really want to make sure, that everything's in the right spot and the right order and all of that kind of stuff, and that's how they feel recharged. And if they were to try to spend a lot of their time creating something from nothing, right, they'd feel like they're just staring at a blank piece of paper with no idea what to do. And so, those are just a couple of kind of examples. But I think thinking through, like, this is the type of work that I tend to find really recharging, um, and why, is really, really helpful. And for a lot of folks, what I recommend is that they do a little bit of an exercise where you take a sheet of paper, right? You draw a line down the middle, and on the left side, working backwards from now, you think through, work experiences and professional experiences and that kind of stuff. Individual experiences or projects that you really loved doing, right? And then on the right side of the paper, you do the same, but think through experiences you really hated doing. And you start, with now, and you work your way backwards, like through college and even like grade school, and anything that sort of like remotely resembles work, right? Like projects you had to do, or things where you didn't have to do it, but you spent a lot of time doing it, right? Like you got into a flow state or anything like that is sort of fair game, right?
Mhm.
And so you write those experiences down and then you start to look at commonalities, right? Why did I feel that way in this experience? Right. And you'll know you're doing it right if you're getting into sort of like individual experiences, right? So not like, oh, I spent 2 years at this job and I really hated it, but like, oh, like there was this one project at this job that I absolutely hated, and then there was this other project I really liked, right?
Mhm.
And you start to look at the commonalities. And for me, when I did that exercise, what I noticed was that sort of, creation aspect, right? Like that's one of my primary motivations is to create things. And so, designing things from scratch, right? Building things from nothing was always very, very motivating for me. But spending, lots of time getting like the exact right little change for something that somebody else created, I found really boring and demotivating. Right. And I think, if you do this exercise, you'll start to see some commonalities. Right. It was kind of thing where like, this went all the way back to being as a kid, right? Like I remember loving playing with Legos, but it wasn't just that I liked playing with them. It was how I played with them, right? Like I would follow the instructions on the Lego kit to put the thing together, but that was always like a little bit tedious for me. And the next day, I had taken it apart and built something else with it, right? Whereas I remember distinctly one of my friends, as a kid growing up and being like, he would build that thing and leave it exactly how it was and not make any changes to it. Right. And like, I remember one time being like, oh, like, let's take this apart and him being really upset. And I think those types of experiences, right, and your reaction to them is going to speak to the things that do and don't motivate you, and sort of inform what you need in order to not get burnt out.
Yeah, exactly. Like in my experience, I am totally oriented around like very distant future. And whenever I know that I'm going in the right direction, I'm just focusing on the improvement and on the direction. So what motivates me is that when I look back on the last year report and I see the progress, and I have like the long term or life goals defined, and I know that I'm hitting there. Um, it doesn't matter if I will reach them really, but the constant improvement is what really drives me. And for example, like I'm totally not bored with long projects. If I need to, like, I don't care really. I'm just doing things that need to be done, but but only if I see the progress in my improvement or the improvement of the people around me or the team or whatever. So yeah, cool that you shared that. I really find this very resonated with me as well. But you are also helping people, helping freelancers to do their work better and more efficient. And therefore, I expect that burning out or avoiding burning out is also a thing that you can help. So, would you like to share a few things about the freelance GPS project that you are working on? And what I'm particularly interested is like what were the reasons that you started it, and um, and if it was like a straightforward success, because you can share like if you want how much success it did, but there's like these things a lot of people only see when you already have a success. There is this journey skipped and always hidden behind. And so I'm interested. Like, is this your first side hustle or not? And you know how much of your income or your daily or weekly engagement it takes to actually drive it, like in proportions to the freelancing work.
Got it. Yeah, so it's definitely not my first side hustle by any means. I think given that I just shared with you like my core motivation around creation, right? You can probably imagine like I've had various things that I've been working on pretty much constantly throughout my career. I'd say this is far and away one of the most successful that's been a side hustle. And to understand like kind of where it came from, I really got to take you back to when first started freelancing full time, which was in 2019. And I think ironically, my freelance journey started with a job search. I have, worked in startups pretty much my whole career, which, as I mentioned earlier, can be quite volatile. And what I found, um, basically, I found myself in this job search because the CEO of the startup that I had working with at the time decided to take it in a direction that I really wasn't excited about. But I wasn't really finding another startup role I wanted to do. Right, I went on a bunch of interviews. I got a couple of offers, but it was nothing I was like thrilled to go and do. And so I realized like, all right, maybe I should give freelancing a shot. Like I had freelanced on the side a little bit, but I'd never really thought about it as a career. And it was a little bit of a scary decision because I was saving for my wedding at the time. I was saving for a house, and I knew I didn't want to like tap into that savings because those are obviously like pretty important life goals. And so I knew I was going to have to make something work and figure something out pretty quickly. Um, and fast forward to today, right? I've got my freelance business is going to do about 480K this year. So it's I've had quite a bit of success. But I think more important than the sort of financial success is how it's changed my life. I find myself, substantially less stressed than I was as a freelancer. I have way more flexibility. And my wife and I spent a year kind of traveling around the U.S. and Mexico and Canada doing the digital nomad thing. I've time to work on side projects. I can work when and where and how I want. And so a couple of years ago, when I started to realize like how kind of transformational this had been, I really wanted to sort of pay that forward. And so it started with me just kind of publishing, some content on things that had worked well for me, and really sort of morphed into several courses and one-on-one coaching, based on people asking me to, could I coach them, and that kind of thing. So I'd say, to answer your question about like time commitment and that kind of thing, um, I'd say typically I spend about, anywhere between 5 and 10 hours a week. That's probably an average. Some weeks it's more like 20. And some weeks it's more like 2. And so there definitely is a range. It's not been, nearly as profitable as my freelancing gig. But that's partially because I'm not really necessarily trying to make it as profitable. For me, it's I think a lot more about paying it forward and the reward and that kind of stuff. And the revenue is kind of just like a nice bonus. But it's been I think really fun, and I also think it's made me personally a better freelancer, because I get to see what works and what doesn't, with so many people. So I have about 10,000 subscribers to my newsletter. I've coached a little over 100 people one-on-one, and it's been just a ton of fun along the way.
And what technology are you working with? Like, are you like JavaScript developer, or what kind of developer you are?
Yeah, yeah. So about half of my clients are Shopify in one way, shape, or form. Some of them are on Liquids. Some of them are on Shopify's Hydrogen platform, which is a Next.js based platform, effectively. And then the rest of them are React and Node. So I do a lot of JavaScript work, quite a bit of HTML and CSS as well. I've got, I don't know, 1 or 2 odd clients on, other stuff. Like I've got a WordPress client and a couple of other clients using other technology, but the vast majority of what I do is JavaScript, and HTML and CSS.
So, do you have some statistics around the salaries and so on? Because, for example, like to the context, in I'm working with Ruby, and in Ruby in US, the average salary for the senior developer is around, I don't know, 19,000 per year, or around 100,000 per year, USD. So, and you're topping it like 5 times, as a freelancer, with the same amount of hours, I guess. I'm not expecting you to work 100 hours per week. So, different questions coming out of my mind right now. First of all, what makes developer a successful freelancer? So this is the first thing. And the second thing is how to price you up, how to decide how much you will charge per hour your clients. So because you, as a freelancer, you are kind of taking like more risk because you have no a safe job. So what are the ratio here that you could share maybe? And you can also say how much of it is shared in your course, and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm really glad you asked this question because it's a lot of what I focus on. How to earn more as a freelance developer is a huge focus of both my free course and my one-on-one coaching. And I think at the end of the day, many developers who go freelance, start with kind of a fundamental sort of mistake in their thinking, right? Which is that being a better developer um, is the most important thing when it comes to income. And the reality is that's not really true. There's, a little bit of a sort of baseline requirement, right? You need to be competent in what you're doing. But beyond that, becoming a better and better developer typically does not increase your income substantially. It increases a little bit, but there start to be kind of diminishing returns pretty quickly. And fundamentally, what you need to do if you want to earn high rates, right, is make sure that you are working with the right type of clients and in the right way. Having coached over 100 developers one on one, and also working with 10,000 of them, and getting lots of questions and comments and conversations going over email and other channels. What I have found almost universally to be true is that the most successful freelancers are working with the best clients. And when you think about that, that makes sense, right? Good clients value the work you do. They can afford to pay premium rates, and in fact, they want to because they want to pay for quality. They are well versed in the types of projects you're doing. So even if you're like primary stakeholder or somebody from marketing or sales, right, they at least understand enough to ask smart questions and give good feedback, right? And they're easy to sell into and they're easy to work with, right? And if you're working with those types of clients, life as a freelancer is fantastic, right? You get a lot of flexibility and autonomy. You can charge a lot, and you get to have a lot of fun, right? Those types of clients even refer business your way, and so you can spend less time kind of doing the sales and marketing thing, right? But if you're working with bad clients, right, they tend to pinch pennies, right? They're constantly trying to like focus on pushing your prices down. They're constantly changing the scope. They're asking for more for less money. And your life becomes kind of grind, right? And that can be a recipe for burnout. So the first thing to do is to understand who the best clients tend to be, and focus your efforts on going after them, right? And there's a bunch of different types of companies that can be good fits, but for me, what I found is tech startups and e-commerce companies, particularly between about 5 and 50 employees, tend to be really, really good clients, almost universally. They are big enough that they are either cash flow positive, right, or they've got funding from somewhere. So that's a good indication that they can afford to pay premium rates, right? They are tech first companies, right? Like every e-commerce company and every tech startup, like understands the web to some degree, right? So like you don't have to spend time explaining why like designing for mobile is important, right? Like they just get it. Which means they're easier to work with. There's not nearly as much hand holding, and they have, I think, a really easy sales process and a really easy process for working with them because they're still relatively small, right? So big enough to be profitable, small enough to be easy to work with. So going after those folks, I think, is really, really good strategy because they tend to pay more. And you can even see that if you're a full-time developer, right? Like you mentioned, like the average, salary for a Ruby developer in the U.S. is 90 to 100,000 a year, right? If you go work for a tech startup and you do Ruby, right, that number goes way up, right? It goes to like 140 or 150, with the exact same level of experience, right? So that in and of itself, right, can get you more in that direction. But I think the other thing that you want to do is position yourself the right way, right? If you position yourself as just a developer and like, your marketing, your sales conversation is all focused on like just the technology, right? You're going to command the salary or the fees that a developer would get. If, on the other hand, what you're focused on is your client's business problems, right? Like increasing revenue, decreasing costs, those types of things, right? And you treat your code just as the medium, right, by which you're solving those problems, right? Your paint and canvas, not the art itself. Um, you can command much more. And
Mhm.
so, I think a large part of it is that, right? Like finding clients who have a clear business problem that they really want to solve, and positioning yourself as, the one who can solve it, let you charge more. And so I think that's a large part of the strategy, right? And I think fundamentally one of the things that separates the top earners and the most successful freelancers from sort of the average.
Awesome, thanks. And there's about positioning yourself. Do you like we are heading into the end of the time that we have scheduled for today, but I have a few more questions. Um, for positioning yourself, do you have some recommendations? The example for me again is that I am kind of technology oriented. At the moment, I am fairly in love with Hanami stuff, with Ruby stuff, and I'm spreading the word about this by publishing videos and articles around it. And because I'm working for the niche, um, it positioned myself as a technology geek, technology oriented geek, but it allows me to be in the top niche of the market. And by doing this way, I can skip several things like localizations adjustments, for example, or I can work for the US salaries, and not for like Poland salaries, because Poland is just cheap country in relation of that. So do you have any tips, like for me blogging, especially these videos that I'm making is very very important and very profitable stuff indirectly, but do you have any other tips, or maybe you can relate also to that?
Yeah. So I think one of my recommendations would be to start stacking complementary skills, right? So many developers, I think, just go in with that, like, hey, I'm a developer, right? I do this kind of work, and that's sort of it, right? But if you can say instead, like, I'm a developer, but I also know just enough UX design to be dangerous, or just enough conversion rate optimization, or just enough SEO to be dangerous, right? You can often command a substantially higher rate if you're getting those types of projects, right? Because you can work cross functionally. And so for me, like the vast majority of the work that I do is on projects, or ongoing work with clients in the form of retainers that are focused on increasing revenue, right? For those clients in one way, shape, or form, right? So a lot of it is conversion rate optimization work, right? Like, how do we get more of a site's visitors to turn into customers and spend more in one way, shape, or form, right? That is obviously work that's very, very close to the company's revenue, right? And the closer you get to the company's revenue, the more money you can charge. And fundamentally, I'm mostly doing development work, right? But knowing UX design, knowing the fundamentals of conversion, and being able to advise on the strategy, right? And the structure of the tests and all of that kind of stuff gives me a huge advantage, right? With clients who are revenue focused and like really focused on a business goal. Which means I can charge, in some cases, 2 or 3 times what another developer would charge, for work that from like a technical standpoint is exactly the same, right? But from an output standpoint, from a benefit to my client standpoint, it's substantially more valuable,
Mhm.
because it's driving the business result that they really care about, which is making
Awesome. That's a very important question. Um, yeah, don't have more time really to ask you another topics, but that was extremely educational. Um, so if people would like to know more, and if people would like to get in touch to you, how they could reach out to?
Yeah, so you can find me at freelancegps.com. I've got a free course there, which I definitely recommend checking out. It takes you through um, in detail a lot of the things that we've talked about today on the call, right? Like how to identify your ideal clients, how to start meeting them, how to close the sale. I also do free strategy sessions. So if you want to sit down and chat for an hour about whether freelancing is a good fit for you, or if you already have a freelance business and you're looking to kind of take it to the next level, how you can do that. We'll chat and I'll put together a kind of personalized roadmap for you. Um, you can also hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn. But yeah, excited to chat with anybody who wants to, and hopefully I can help you hit your goals.
Awesome. Thank you. All the links, as usual, will be in the show notes of this episode. So thank you very much. It was a blast and it was amazing to have you as a guest. So thank you for being here. And I hope we will reach out again in the future. And yeah, I wish you a lot of success. And definitely, I will take your course to check out how I can improve on my stuff as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. See you then. Have a happy, great day. Bye.